123 countries voted in favor of the resolution. 3 voted against it, including the United States. And 52 countries abstained, including the UK and all of the European Union.
Those in favor of the draft resolution A/80/L48, please signify. Those against and those in abstention.
The Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/80/L48 entitled Declaration of the Trafficking of Enslaved Africans and Racialized Chattel Enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 123, against 3, abstentions 52. Therefore, draft resolution A/80/L48 is adopted.
The UN General Assembly has declared that slavery is the gravest crime against humanity, specifically the enslavement of some 12 million Africans and their descendants through the transatlantic slave trade. The resolution put forward by Ghana was harshly criticized by the United States, where tens of millions of descendants of enslaved Africans live today. We'll be talking about that later on. First, I want to hear the reaction from Ghana. DW correspondent Isaac Kaleji is in the Ghanaian capital, Accra. Isaac, good to see you.
Thank you, David.
So before we talk more about this historic vote at the UN, let's just look at what the resolution says. The resolution calls the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity. It calls for UN member states to engage in dialogue on a full and formal apology and for reparations as a concrete step toward remedying historical wrongs. The resolution also urges the prompt and unhindered restitution of cultural items to their countries of origin. 123 countries voted in favor of the resolution. 3 voted against it, including the United States, and 52 countries abstained, including the UK and all of the European Union.
Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that they are strongly urged to limit explanations of vote to 5 minutes, which should in any case not exceed 10 minutes and be made from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies. I have the honor to deliver a statement on behalf of the 14 member states of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, in explanation of our vote. CARICOM voted in support of this resolution because of our historical attachment to the issue of the trafficking of enslaved Africans and the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans. The recognition today by those member states that supported this resolution and the declaration is a critical first step towards redressing the injustices perpetuated over the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. In this vein, CARICOM remains a strong advocate for the advancement of reparatory justice for the historical atrocities perpetuated against our forebears during the period of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the persistent legacies thereof. CARICOM therefore reiterates our support in principle for this initiative undertaken by Ghana on behalf of the African Union to advance the issue of reparatory justice. Given the importance of this issue, CARICOM stresses that implementation of the resolution must be done in a collaborative manner and in full partnership with the entire membership. CARICOM commits to contributing to taking forward the implementation of this resolution in line with the region's priorities, including the 10-point plan for reparatory justice. We will continue to engage meaningfully in future discussions on this important issue, including on ways to take forward the important provisions contained in the resolution. I thank you, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Trinidad and Tobago. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Thank you, President. It is clear from the grim testimony that we have heard today that slavery and the transatlantic slave trade were appalling tragedies of an historic scale that constitute grave violations of human dignity and of the fundamental human rights of its victims. New Zealand recognises the profound and lasting impacts of the transatlantic slave trade and thanks Ghana for its efforts in bringing forward this resolution. We acknowledge the historical legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and its lasting impact on many member states, and we welcome the importance placed on continuing education and awareness raising and the increased attention that commemorative events have brought to the issue. New Zealand supports proposals for meaningful, truthful and respectful dialogue among those most impacted, including reparatory justice and reconciliation through appropriate frameworks. We encourage the continued promotion of comprehensive educational programs, memorialization initiatives, and research on slavery, the trafficking of enslaved Africans, and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans and their consequences. We had hoped to be able to vote in favour of this resolution, but regrettably, New Zealand was not in a position to endorse all aspects of the text presented today. New Zealand acknowledges the significance and horrific scale of transatlantic slavery, but it is not able to endorse a text that suggests a hierarchy of crimes against humanity and which has implications for other multilateral processes underway related to the progressive development of international law. New Zealand acknowledges the importance of restorative justice processes, including issues such as reparations, but believes these are more appropriately pursued through relevant judicial tribunals or agreed international legal forums. New Zealand was, unfortunately, not able to vote in favour of the text today, but we thank Ghana and the other co-sponsors once again for the resolution and reaffirm our support for meaningful dialogue, education and progress on addressing the impacts of the transatlantic slave trade. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Peru would like to thank the distinguished delegation of Ghana for this initiative, which has made it possible for us to undertake a serious analysis about the seriousness of these issues. Our vote is consistent with the international commitments that Peru has undertaken in line with our struggle to eradicate racism and all of its structural manifestations. Peru voted in favor of the draft resolution. We are convinced that the transatlantic slave trade of Africans and the system of racialized slavery were violations of human rights of such scope that they demand the attention of the international community today. Their consequences are still being felt today in our societies. Our vote is also an act of recognition to the Afro-Peruvian communities. Some 200,000 Peruvians identify as such in our territory. This constitutes about 4% of our national population. But their political, economic, social and cultural legacy goes beyond these figures, and it is part and parcel of our national identity. Peru has moved forward concrete policies in this domain, including the national policy for Peruvians of African descent going to 2030. But we'd like to make clear some interpretations of this resolution. First of all, we believe that the characterization of the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity contained in OP 2 and 3 is a reference to a particularly serious event in the past which occurred at a specific time in history. We recognize that in line with international law, the commission of an illegal act is something that, if it continues, there have to be appropriate guarantees of repetition and redress adopted. But we note that OP 6 to 8 can be interpreted as a call for constructive dialogue. But this is not in prejudice to the establishment of obligations that could be interpreted as legally binding. The quest for justice should be something that is accessible, universal, and inclusive, free from all kinds of discrimination. The principles reaffirmed in this resolution should be a way of guiding states and should contribute to recognizing the dignity of human beings. Finally, we believe that, well, we would have preferred that a resolution on such an important issue should have been adopted by consensus. We reiterate our solidarity with all of those persons of African descent, and we particularly recognize the damaging legacy of slavery that persists today in a world where there is still racial discrimination as a result of this historical legacy. We will continue to work constructively in the context of this dialogue, and we hope that we can achieve this by consensus. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Peru. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein on behalf of Switzerland and Iceland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I deliver this joint explanation of vote on behalf of Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. At the outset, we underline the importance of the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, and commend efforts to ensure that the profound suffering caused by the trafficking of enslaved Africans is never forgotten nor diminished. To address the enduring consequences of slavery crimes, Liechtenstein launched the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking Initiative to combat modern forms of slavery and human trafficking. Against this background, the process leading to the adoption of this declaration is unfortunately a missed opportunity to broaden consensus and recognize the unprecedented nature of these crimes. We believe that more time and meaningful negotiations were needed to galvanize further support. Although we stressed our intention to support the spirit of this initiative, we, alongside others, raised concerns about inconsistencies of the declaration with international law. In particular, the qualification of the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity has no basis in international law and risk undermining the Rome Statute protecting civilian populations not only against enslavement, but also against other equally atrocious crimes against humanity. This is all the more regrettable as discussions on the inclusion of slavery crimes in the definition of crimes against humanity are taking place at the moment, both as part of the efforts to draft a convention on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity, and also within the framework of the Rome Statute. These discussions are essential to guarantee that such atrocities are not repeated and that modern forms of slaveries do not go unpunished. For these reasons, while we strongly support the underlying objective of recognition, we were unfortunately not in a position to vote in favor of the resolution as adopted. We remain committed to engaging constructively and support the remembrance of the trafficking, the transatlantic slave trade consistent with international law. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein on behalf of Switzerland and Iceland.
Let's go to the US now. Gerald Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston. He's published dozens of books, many of them about slavery, including The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. Gerald, so good to have you with us. What's your reaction to this resolution being passed?
Well, I think it's a significant step forward. Certainly, it'll be quite useful in the United States of America because, as you probably know, there is an ongoing struggle for reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans. You may also know that the administration in Washington, D.C., speaking of that, led by Mr. Trump, is unequivocally hostile to this question of reparations. And I would also like to give a note of celebration and victory, indeed, to the president of Ghana, Mr. Mahama, who is walking in the footsteps of the founding father of his West African nation, speaking of the late, great Kwame Nkrumah. And all around, I think it's a significant step forward.
Yeah, we're definitely going to be talking about reparations in just a second. What does this resolution mean on an emotional and symbolic level for the African diaspora, specifically for people whose ancestors were enslaved?
Well, I think it's quite profound. We in the United States oftentimes recognize that since the population of African descent is a distinct minority, perhaps 13 to 16% of the overall population, we've also and often needed international support and international validation in order to make a step forward. And I think that this resolution at the United Nations is precisely the kind of validation that we have needed in order to propel this movement for reparations, in fact.
So you're saying that basically African Americans, in a sense, needed Ghana to put this resolution forward?
Oh, absolutely. As you may know, the United States is known quite properly as a conservative country. You may also know that polls suggest that a significant percentage of the non-descendants of enslaved Africans are hostile to reparations. They are represented in Washington by Mr. Trump. And so in order to move the needle, we've needed this kind of international validation, which we've just received at the United Nations.
Now, over 50 countries did abstain in this vote, including the UK and the entire European Union. 3 countries, including the US, voted against the resolution. And one reason the US named is that calling slavery the gravest crime against humanity, it said, would create a hierarchy of crimes against humanity, essentially saying that enslavement is worse than other crimes against humanity, including murder and rape and torture. The US ambassador to the UN said, this is not a competition. What's your response to that?
Well, as you probably know, the African slave trade involved murder, rape, and torture. You may also know that the African slave trade lasted for hundreds of years, from the 1500s up until the late 19th century. You may also know that there are still reverberations and repercussions of the unlimited African slave trade in terms of the United States of America, in particular in terms of spiraling rates of incarceration, high rates of unemployment, spectacular rates of infant mortality and death for children. So I think that the resolution in many ways is right on point.
I have the honor now to give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. The United Kingdom recognises the gravity of the issues addressed in this resolution and welcomes the opportunity to set out its position. We have repeatedly recognised the abhorrent nature of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, which inflicted untold harm and misery on millions of people over many decades. Its horrors were profound, and its legacy continues to leave deep scars today. The UK also believes that only by acknowledging and discussing collectively the most painful elements of the history that we share with other nations, including the transatlantic slave trade, can we come together in a spirit of solidarity and mutual respect to respond to the challenges that we all face today. The UK remains committed to that goal. That is why we engaged constructively throughout the negotiations on this resolution in the hope of reaching a consensual-based text. However, despite our efforts, our concerns have not been taken on board. The UK continues to disagree with fundamental propositions of the text and therefore, regrettably, could not vote in favour of it. Firstly, the UK is firmly of the view that we must not create a hierarchy of historical atrocities. Doing so simplifies the complexity and vast scale of suffering endured in different contexts. It risks diminishing the experiences of communities whose trauma and suffering was felt just as strongly. No single set of atrocities should be regarded as more or less significant than another. We should approach all historical injustices with the same seriousness, empathy, and respect to ensure that no one group is made to feel that their suffering is being overshadowed or treated as secondary. Furthermore, it's essential and integral to the rule of law that the formation and evolution of international law is governed by clear and well-defined principles. The principles of intertemporality and non-retroactivity are long-standing tenets of international law. They are essential to ensuring legal stability. According to the intertemporal rule, the applicable law is the law of the relevant time. International courts and tribunals have routinely upheld these principles. There is equally no duty to provide reparation for historical acts that were not, at the time those acts were committed, violations of international law. These principles cannot be circumvented by recourse to the concept of continuing harms. The UK welcomes that states have developed international law such that today's slavery and the slave trade are rightly prohibited by treaties and under customary international law, and enslavement is now recognised as a constituent element of a crime against humanity. Nonetheless, it's important to acknowledge with deep regret that the prohibitions on slavery, the slave trade, and what are now considered crimes against humanity had not yet been established in international law at the time of the transatlantic slave trade. None of the recognised sources of international law, as set out in Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, identify a prohibition on slavery and the slave trade until the 20th century. The United Kingdom appreciates that Ghana, on behalf of the African Union, consistently stressed that this resolution was not to be read as a legal document. This was restated by the drafters at every informal consultation. In this context, the UK and others offered specific language to move the text away from legal to political discourse, while still reflecting the sheer gravity and horror of the acts. Member States also suggested the text should be considered by the Sixth Committee. Again, this was met with the response that this was a political declaration. The United Kingdom is keen to underscore this point on the AU's intention, while we continue to regret the failure to accept language that would have put the matter beyond doubt. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Let's hear what the US ambassador to the UN had to say.
The United States strongly objects to the cynical usage of historical wrongs as a leverage point in an attempt to reallocate modern resources to people and nations who are distantly related to the historical victims.
U.S. Ambassador Dan Negria speaking there. Gerald, what's your response to this idea that it's too late for reparations called for slavery?
Well, I disagree ferociously. In fact, as you may know, there is a principle of U.S. law which suggests that when there is a wrong, there should be a remedy. The wrong was the enslavement of millions. The remedy is reparations. And in any case, I was rather mystified by the fact that the U.S. ambassador spoke of countries receiving reparations when in his own backyard in New York City, there are millions of descendants of enslaved Africans who are living in desperate poverty as we speak, as direct relationship to the crime against humanity that was the African slave trade.
Now, you are also a lawyer, so I want to ask you about another criticism brought up by the U.S., and I'm quoting Ambassador Negria here. While we acknowledge the horrors of the past, the United States also does not recognize a legal right to reparations for historical wrongs that were not illegal under international law at the time when they occurred. Gerald, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that that's a questionable invocation of law. And I might also go a step forward to suggest that next in line for reparations, at least in North America, are the descendants of the indigenous population, the Native American population, who were subjected to genocide, which was the condition precedent to dragging Africans chained across the ocean to work for free. And certainly it's rather disappointing, I must say, that many members of the European Union voted against this voted against this resolution concerning the African slave trade. Now, I know that they want to stay on the good side of Mr. Trump, but even having said that, I think that the ultimate and the utmost of cynicism is the vote of nations like Britain and Portugal and Spain, whose current standard of living and current modernity is attached and connected directly to the unlamented African slave trade.
They said colonization ended in the 1960s, that France left Africa alone. That's a lie. I dug into France's footprint in Africa, and what I found didn't just reek of colonialism, it screamed exploitation dressed in a suit and tie. Let's rewind. Between the late 1800s and the mid-20th century, France controlled huge swaths of Africa, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Chad, Central African Republic, Republic of Congo, Gabon, Cameroon, Djibouti, Madagascar, and more. By the 1960s, one by one, these countries gained independence. But France didn't pack up and leave, it rebranded. Most of West and Central Africa still use a currency called the CFA franc. But here's the kicker. It's printed in France, controlled by France, fixed to the euro by France.
Imagine another country setting your interest rates, controlling your reserves, and dictating your monetary policy. That's neo-colonialism.
To this day, 14 African countries, including Senegal, Mali, Ivory Coast, Benin, and Cameroon, are locked into this system. France holds 50% of their foreign reserves in the French treasury. No joke. France claims to help with security, like in Mali, where they launched Operation Barkhane in 2014, supposedly to fight jihadist terror. But guess what? That presence also means political influence, military bases, and billions in arms deals. Every time African leaders defied France's interests, coup, sanctions, isolation, Guinea under Sékou Touré said no to French neo-colonial control in 1958, France left, and stripped Guinea bare, schools destroyed, infrastructure wrecked, officials sabotaged, Mali bleeds gold, Niger bleeds uranium, Gabon bleeds oil, and who profits? Not the people living there. France gets cheap raw materials, Africa gets pollution, poverty, and puppet leaders.
Your lights shine in Paris because our children work in uranium mines.
Niger provides over 20% of France's uranium, enough to power millions of homes in France. Meanwhile, 90% of Nigerians don't have electricity. People are waking up. Mali kicked French troops out, Burkina Faso followed, Niger booted the French ambassador. For the first time in decades, African nations are saying enough.
We don't want charity. We want freedom, real independence, not flags and parades while France still pulls the strings.
France built its empire on African backs, and today, it still feeds off the continent's blood. Colonization didn't die, it just changed its name.
I give the floor to the representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
The Kingdom of the Netherlands remains firmly committed to addressing racism and discrimination. We share the importance that the African group attaches to the lasting consequences of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. We fully recognize the profound injustice of this history and its continued impact today. In December 2022, the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of the Netherlands offered formal apologies for the actions of the Dutch state towards enslaved people in the past, who suffered as a consequence of those actions everywhere in the world, as well as to all their descendants up to the present day. In July 2023, His Majesty King Willem-Alexander apologized for the Netherlands' slavery past. As a member of the European Union, we engage constructively in the negotiations on this resolution, and we greatly appreciate the efforts by Ghana and the African Union to bring forward this important initiative. In this vein, I would like to also say that we align ourselves with the statement delivered by the EU, and we sincerely regret that no consensus could be reached on a formulation that addresses key legal and substantive concerns. Having said that, the Kingdom of the Netherlands cannot support references that suggest the retroactive application of international law, including the implication of a legal obligation to provide reparations for acts that were not a violation of international law at the time they were committed. We also cannot agree to the introduction of a hierarchy among crimes against humanity, including the designation of one as the gravest, nor to references related to the non-applicability of statutory limitations. For these reasons, Mr. Chair, and despite the importance we attach to this very subject matter, my delegation has abstained on this resolution. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
What's your thoughts? Please be respectful with your comments. Also, please click the like, click the notification bell, and subscribe to this channel.
Listen, Genesis chapter 11 verse 10 explains the genealogy of Shem. Shem was a black man in Africa. If you repeat this back, Genesis 14 verse 13, Abraham steps on the scene. Being a descendant of Shem, which is a fact, means Abraham too was black. Abraham, born in the city of a black man, called Nimrod, grandson of Ham. Ham had 4 sons. One was named Canaan. Here, let me do some explaining. Abraham, Isaac was the... Jacob had 12 sons, for real, and these were the children of Israel. According to Genesis chapter 10, these were the children of Israel. According to Genesis chapter 10, these were the children of Israel. According to Genesis chapter 10.